Have you ever dreamed of waking up, only to realize you can't remember your own name? Have you ever felt like you're living someone else's memories instead of your own? Have you ever heard whispering behind a door that's been sealed with salt and rusted charms? Welcome back to the Whisper Horror Channel, the channel that tells stories not everyone dares to hear all the way through. If you're listening late at night, drop a comment below. Tell me how far into the story you still remember your name. Tonight, we step into one of the places known as the heart that stopped beating in America. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, an abandoned psychiatric hospital in West Virginia. Once home to people who weren't sick, just inconvenient to society. A place where they removed parts of the brain, simply because someone didn't fit in. But the most terrifying thing in that building isn't the screams or the ghosts. It's the souls who can no longer remember their names. And tonight, someone is about to enter the room with no doorknob. Room 312, the room where the whispering never stops. Keep your headphones close. Don't fall asleep, because if you forget who you are, you might never find your way back. The town of Weston, West Virginia, didn't welcome strangers with open arms. It welcomed them with a silence so heavy it seemed to soak into the air, saturating every wooden porch, every window pane clouded by dust, every slat of cracked paint on the aging homes that lined its narrow streets. Silence in Weston wasn't merely the absence of sound, it was the echo of something buried, something that pulsed just beneath the surface, in the roots of the trees, in the sagging frames of forgotten doorways, in the way the locals didn't quite meet your eyes. For Rowan Hatcher, the quiet here felt almost physical, like a veil thrown over the world the moment he crossed the city limits. It wrapped around his old Ford pickup like a damp shroud, slipped in through the cracked seals in the windows, and clung to his senses with the smell of rotting leaves and wet earth clinging to the final breath of October. The sky above hung low and grey, a leaden curtain that pressed against the world and drained it of color. Everything beneath it, houses, streets, trees, looked washed out, as if Weston had long since stopped expecting the return of sunlight and had settled instead into a permanent state of fading. Rowan pulled the collar of his worn wool coat higher and squinted at the rusted welcome sign as he drove past. He hadn't come here to relax or to explore. He came for a purpose. For a pull he hadn't been able to shake for 6 long months, ever since he'd chosen the topic for his graduate thesis in history. The title sounded clinical, academic: The Selfhood Reconstruction Experiment, a Study of Identity Erasure at Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, 1950 to 1970. But the truth behind the paper was far more personal. There was only one person in the world Rowan had shared it with, his thesis advisor, Professor Alistair Hines. Because what had drawn him here wasn't a theory. It was a photograph. Faded, yellowing, tucked in the back of a family album. A woman in her 20s with dark eyes that mirrored his. His great-grandmother, Elara. She had spent her final years within the stone walls of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Her death certificate had read only melancholia. Her name had been crossed out, replaced with a number. Rowan drove slowly down the main street. The town looked like it was breathing its final breath. A few shops still clung to life, but the flickering amber lights in their windows did nothing to cut the sense of abandonment that hung in the air. The few people he saw on the sidewalk walked slowly, their shoulders hunched as if weighed down by something unseen. He knew what it was. The weight cast by the silhouette on the hill, the looming presence that dominated every skyline, every conversation, even if no one dared say its name. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. For tourists, it was a landmark, a curiosity, a place to pay $20 for a ghost tour. For Weston, it was something else entirely. The dead heart of the town. A silence that still bled into everything, long after the screaming had stopped. His boarding house stood at the edge of town, a 2-story wooden house painted white long ago, now yellowing with time and disrepair. The woman who greeted him at the door introduced herself as Martha, elderly, warm smile, but sharp eyes that studied him carefully. as if measuring what kind of man he might be. "You must be Rowan Hatcher," she said with the unmistakable appellation lilt. Professor Hines called ahead. "Said you'd be staying here a while. To research the hill." She didn't need to specify which hill. In Weston. There was only one. "Yes, Mom," Rowan said, accepting the brass key she held out to him. "Thank you for letting me stay." "Make yourself comfortable," she said. Tone kind, but not soft. "It's quiet around here. Maybe too quiet for a young man like you." Her eyes lingered. "Just don't let the old stories keep you up at night." Rowan dropped his duffel bag in the attic room, a cramped space with a slanted ceiling, a single bed, and a desk pressed against the far wall. He didn't waste time unpacking. He hadn't come to Weston to rest. As the last light of day slipped behind the hills, he climbed back into his truck and followed the winding road toward the place that had haunted his thoughts for months. And then it rose into view. No photograph had prepared him for the sheer magnitude of Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. It didn't feel like architecture. It felt like something alive. A thing that stretched and breathed and remembered. The main building, hewn from sandstone, sprawled across nearly a quarter-mile of land. Endless corridors, flanked by arched windows that stood tall and empty like rows of sightless eyes. The outer walls were overgrown and cracked, moss climbing like veins across their surface, as if the land itself had tried to reclaim it and failed. The wind hissed through broken gutters and fractured doorways, producing a sound that wasn't quite a howl, but more like a long, exhausted exhale, a sigh made by something too large and too old to care about being heard anymore. Rowan stepped out of his truck and felt dwarfed, exposed. The air was colder here. He stood for a moment, letting the full weight of the place sink into his chest. He didn't enter. Not yet. Instead, he walked the gravel perimeter, his boots crunching with each step, letting the presence of the asylum soak into his bones. He could almost feel it. The overpopulation, the desperation, the screams that had once echoed behind those walls. It was like standing beside a collapsed cathedral, holy in its brokenness, but not holy in peace, holy in suffering. This wasn't just where identities had been lost. This was where they had been stolen. A bit overwhelming, isn't it, Mr. Hatcher? Rowan startled and turned. He hadn't heard the footsteps. Professor Alistair Hines stood behind him. Tall, lean, early 60s. With meticulously combed salt and pepper hair and the kind of tailored tweed coat that suggested someone more at home in an Oxford lecture hall than a crumbling American asylum. He held a worn leather notebook under one arm and smiled in a way that was both genuine and unsettling. "Hello, Professor," Rowan said, extending his hand. The shake was firm, but dry, like old parchment. "It's much bigger than I imagined." "Big? Yes," Hines replied, glancing toward the building with something that looked almost like affection. "And empty. But sometimes emptiness speaks louder than anything else. I'm always pleased when a young scholar seeks out forgotten histories. Most chase monarchs and battles. Very few ask what happened to those the world wanted to forget." They walked side by side along the main wall. The only sound was gravel beneath their shoes. Hines spoke quietly, as if the building might listen in. He told Rowan about Dr. Thomas Kirkbride, the idealist who believed architecture could heal, who built this place with sunlight, symmetry, and hope in mind. But then his tone shifted. The budget cuts, the crowding, the madness of progress turned inward on itself. "What we're studying here, Rowan," Hines said, stopping in front of a boarded-up window, "is not just the lives that were lived. It's the ones that were erased. This place didn't just contain people. It unmade them. They came in with names, histories, families, and by the end, they were numbers, diagnoses, corpses buried beneath unnamed stones." Rowan nodded. Something about Hines unnerved him. But there was no denying the man understood what this place truly was. and he understood what Rowan had come to find. My thesis focuses on file 312. Rowan said. Patients marked as cured and reintegrated between 1955 and 1960. But there's no trace of them. No social security. No work history. No death certificates. They didn't rejoin society. It's like they vanished. Hines' eyes lit up behind the lenses. A marvelous subject. Bold. File 312 is one of this place's enduring mysteries. Officially, most original records were lost in a storage fire sometime in the 70s. But I've never trusted official accidents. He tapped his leather-bound notebook. I found pieces. Nurse journals. Memos. Personal notes. The fragments are still out there. But it will be hard work. You'll need to live and breathe this place. Will you? Rowan hesitated only a second. Then he met the professor's eyes. I will. The attic room was colder than Rowan had anticipated. The radiator beneath the slanted window gave off only the faintest warmth. Its rusted pipes groaning in protest with each passing gust of wind outside. The wooden beams above him creaked and shifted like restless limbs. It wasn't just the chill that unsettled him, but the kind of stillness that settled into the bones of old houses, an uneasy stillness that felt less like peace and more like something watching, waiting. He sat hunched over the narrow desk, the pale glow of his laptop screen casting long shadows on the walls. Beyond the glass, Weston had already gone to sleep. Not the restless, pulsing sleep of cities, but something quieter, deeper, a kind of permanent dusk that hung in the air like forgotten breath. On the screen, lines of digitized handwriting stared back at him. The files Professor Hines had provided were scanned nurse logs from the 1950s, pulled from an archive too obscure to be indexed anywhere public. At first, the notes were banal, routine entries about medication times, bedwetting incidents, dietary complaints, but then they started to change. The handwriting in the entries grew sloppier. Words began to trail off. Some entries skipped dates entirely. One log, dated March 3, 1956, had been struck through with a thick black line, and beside it, scribbled hastily in red pencil, were the words, File 312, Internal Transfer. Rowan sat up straighter. The scanned page showed the following: Patient ID, unknown. No external records. No family visitation on file. Behavior, mute. Eats only when instructed. Does not respond to name or touch. Repeats a single phrase continuously under breath. There was a dark smear on the paper, possibly ink. Possibly blood. The scan quality was poor, but Rowan could still make out the final sentence beneath the stain. He keeps asking, "What is my name?" Something in his chest went still. He read the line again, and then again. The words weren't chilling because of what they said, but because of what they implied. This wasn't a patient who had forgotten who he was. This was someone who had been stripped of the very framework by which people remember anything at all. Name. Identity. Existence. Rowan leaned back from the screen. The air around him suddenly thinner. The attic ceiling seemed lower. The corners darker. He reached up and rubbed his temple. A dull ache had begun to build behind his eyes. He shut the laptop. The room, dimly lit by the distant orange of a street lamp outside the window, seemed to fold in around him. The narrow bed looked like a coffin. His breath fogged slightly in the cold air as he pulled off his shirt and slipped beneath the covers. Still fully clothed from the waist down, the sheets were stiff and dry, carrying the faint scent of mothballs. He closed his eyes, repeating to himself that he was simply tired, that he had driven too far, thought too much, stared at too many grim words on a glowing screen. But when sleep came, it did not come gently. He was walking down a corridor. The tiles beneath his feet were cracked and stained. The walls were painted a sickly institutional green, peeling in long strips like paper bark. The ceiling was low, oppressive, flickering with the cold stutter of dying fluorescent bulbs. He could hear no sound, but somehow, He knew that something waited ahead. The corridor stretched longer than it should have. The numbers on the doors blurred past: 306, 308, 310, and then he stopped. 312. The door was closed. Its paint had blistered and flaked from moisture, exposing swollen wood and rusting hinges. Something about the air outside that room felt dense, as if pressure was being applied to every atom surrounding it. He reached for the knob, not of his own will, but as if compelled by something behind his own thoughts. His hands touched metal. It was ice cold, like something that had not been touched in years. When he turned it, the door opened inward without resistance. There was no room inside. No walls. No floor. Just blackness. Not the kind that comes from lack of light, but the kind that consumes light. An absolute void. He stood on the threshold, leaning slightly forward. And in that impossible black, something spoke. It did not shout. It did not groan. It whispered, dry, soft, and broken. The voice said, "What is my name?" Rowan awoke with a gasp. The attic room was silent. His sheets were damp. His shirt clung to his back with sweat. Moonlight cut through the window, casting sharp silver beams across the floor. He sat upright, heart pounding, breath rapid. His fingers dug into the mattress. It had been a dream. It had to have been a dream. But the cold in the room was deeper now. And as he rubbed his hands together for warmth, he noticed something strange, something impossible. His palms smelled faintly of antiseptic. Morning came without warmth. The light that crept through the attic window had the color of tin, cold and metallic, casting dull reflections off the floorboards like a wet sheen on steel. Rowan sat at the edge of the bed, staring down at his hands. He had washed them 3 times since waking, but the smell lingered faintly, stubborn and clinical, antiseptic. He didn't remember touching anything in the room. The desk was old, but clean. The faucet in the bathroom ran brown for a moment, but the sink was lined with fresh soap and a dry towel. There was no reason the scent should have remained, except there was no reason for the dream to feel real either. But it had. Far too real. He had never sleepwalked in his life. And yet when he woke, the soles of his feet were dusted with grit. Not from the bedroom floor, but something finer, like the remnants of ash or decaying plaster. He dressed without urgency, though his thoughts were anything but calm. In the mirror, he noticed his eyes looked different, less tired, perhaps, but not more awake, sharper, as if something inside them had adjusted, focused. He packed his satchel with a notepad, a voice recorder, a camera, and the printed scans of the nurse logs. Then he left the boarding house without breakfast. Martha was not in the kitchen, and for that he was quietly grateful. He didn't feel ready to speak. Not until he could explain something to himself first. The town of Weston had not changed overnight. But Rowan noticed details now that had eluded him before. A boarded window above the pharmacy bore scratch marks around the edges. The mural on the side of the local bank, painted to celebrate community health, showed a man in a white coat whose eyes had been scribbled out in fading red ink. A boy on a bicycle stared at him as he passed. Not with curiosity, but with recognition. And yet, Rowan was certain he'd never seen the child before. He parked the truck near the county library, a squat brick building that smelled of paper and mildew even from the parking lot. Inside, he was greeted by a young woman at the front desk with tired eyes and a name tag that read Emily. She gave a polite smile when he introduced himself. And when he mentioned the asylum, that smile tightened ever so slightly. "Not much left in the public archive," she said, already standing from her chair. "Most of what we had was pulled years ago, liability stuff. You know how it goes." "I was hoping to look at any microfilm from the local paper between 1955 and 1965, Rowan said. "Particularly anything referencing patients reintegrated into the community." Emily nodded and led him past several empty tables and into a back room. The microfilm reader looked like it hadn't been touched since the Clinton administration. but it still worked. Rowan spent the next 4 hours scrolling through reels, his fingers growing numb from the metal handle, eyes burning from the screen's harsh light. What he found was not what he expected. There were records, dozens of them, of patients being released from Trans-Allegheny between 1956 and 1959. Some were named, others listed only by number. The articles were brief, often buried in the corners of the paper. What troubled Rowan wasn't their content, but their uniformity. Each one included the same phrases: successfully rehabilitated, transitioned into new housing, supervised employment opportunity. The wording didn't vary, not once. It was as if the articles had been written by a template, or by someone with a vested interest in consistency. He leaned closer. Several clippings referenced addresses where the patients were supposedly placed. One stood out: 14 Harrow Street. It appeared in 3 separate articles for 3 different patients, none of whom shared names or diagnoses. Rowan jotted the address down and slid the final reel back into its sleeve. Emily was gone when he returned to the front desk, but he left a thank you note scribbled on a library card before walking out. Harrow Street was a 20-minute drive from town, toward the outer hills. As he turned onto the road, the houses grew further apart. The street numbers faded from painted wood to crooked mailboxes. Number 14 was a 1-story building nestled between 2 large oak trees, its windows covered in thick plastic, the front steps sunken and cracked. The house looked empty, abandoned for decades. Yet in each newspaper article, this address had been marked as supervised care housing. Rowan parked and approached on foot. The porch groaned under his weight. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. He turned the knob. Locked. He peered into the nearest window, pulling back the plastic slightly, and caught a glimpse of what lay inside. The room beyond was bare. No furniture. No curtains. Just a wooden floor marked with dozens of faint circular scuff marks, like chairs had once been dragged in and out of place, over and over. Against the far wall stood a tall metal cabinet. It was sealed with a padlock and covered in dust, but it was clearly not from the 1950s. Someone had placed it there later. Recently. A chill crept down Rowan's spine. He stepped back, feeling exposed beneath the grey sky. This wasn't a house. It was a storage unit. A placeholder. A facade for something, or someone, long gone. As he turned to leave, a figure emerged from behind the nearest tree. A man, middle-aged, wearing work boots and a maintenance jacket. He carried no tools. His face was unreadable. "You're not from here," the man said flatly. Rowan didn't answer right away. "No. I'm researching the asylum." The man nodded slowly, as if that explained everything. He looked at the house behind Rowan, then back at him. "There's nothing left to find," he said. "What's buried should stay that way." Then he walked off, vanishing into the trees without another word. Rowan stood in place for a long time before getting back in the truck. As he drove away, he glanced at the rearview mirror and saw the house shrink behind him until it was nothing but a shadow tucked between 2 dead oaks. But in his mind, it lingered. The scuff marks, the cabinet, the man's eyes. Some things weren't buried. They were locked. The sky was beginning to darken by the time Rowan returned to the boarding house. The clouds had thickened, not with storm, but with the kind of damp weight that promised long hours of cold silence. He parked the truck, locked it by habit, and walked slowly up the wooden steps to the porch. The air felt still, but not empty. He paused before reaching the door, casting a glance toward the distant hill, just barely visible beyond the rooftops and trees, even cloaked in mist. The asylum's outline dominated the skyline, stoic and patient, as if watching him, as if waiting. Inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Rowan didn't call out for Martha. He didn't want to talk. He climbed the stairs to his attic room and shut the door behind him. The radiator still made its slow, aching groan, but the heat it gave off was weaker than before. The smell of old wood and dust had deepened. Or perhaps he had just grown more aware of it. He dropped his satchel on the bed, took off his coat, and sat down heavily at the desk. He stared at the wall for a long time before turning to his laptop and opening a new document. He tried to write anything. A summary of the day's findings, questions, theories. But his fingers hovered above the keyboard, unmoving. His mind felt bloated with fragments, images of newspaper clippings, the address on Harrow Street, the metal cabinet behind the plastic-covered window, the man who told him to leave it buried. And beneath it all, something deeper stirred. The voice from the dream. The one that had asked, not with malice or rage, but with a trembling kind of confusion, "What is my name?" He shut the laptop and stood. His reflection caught in the mirror near the door. It wasn't a full mirror, just a narrow vertical strip beside the coat rack. But in that reflection, for a fraction of a second, he saw something he couldn't explain. His face. Yes. But off. The eyes too dark. The skin too smooth. The posture too still. It vanished when he blinked. The reflection returned to normal. Yet the unease remained, settling in his stomach like a slow, cold knot. Rowan turned off the light and lay down on the bed fully clothed. He didn't plan to sleep. But sleep didn't ask for permission. This time. The dream was not a hallway. It was a room. He stood in the center of a chamber, high ceilings, cracked stone walls, and a window covered by black drapes. A rusted hospital bed sat in the corner, its mattress stained and bare. The floor beneath him was lined with old tiles, some missing, others covered in something that looked like mold but smelled like ash. He looked down at his hands and saw that they were no longer his. Thinner, pale, slightly trembling. He turned toward the window, drawn by something behind the curtain. When he pulled it aside, there was no outside, only a reflection of the room itself, inverted in the glass. But in that mirrored image, there was someone else standing behind him. A woman, slender, long dark hair, eyes like voids. She was not touching him, but he felt her breath on his neck. And then, her voice, not in his ears, but in his thoughts. Soft, cracked, yet unmistakably human. "Elara," she said. "My name is Elara." He turned. There was no one there. He woke with a start. Mouth dry. Lungs tight. The room was completely dark. The radiator had gone silent. Even the wind outside had stopped. His ears rang in the stillness. He sat up slowly. The sheets were cold and damp again. He didn't remember sweating. He didn't remember dreaming. But her name lingered like smoke in his mouth. Elara. He had never spoken it aloud. He hadn't even thought it clearly in weeks. And yet, she had given it to him. Rowan rose, stepped to the window, and looked out toward the black silhouette of the asylum, now shrouded in fog. A shape in the dark. A memory too large to hold. Something was opening. Not a door. Not a tunnel. A wound. And her name was only the beginning. The next morning, Rowan didn't bother with the pretense of normalcy. He skipped the kitchen. Didn't greet Martha. Didn't make coffee. The cold had settled into his bones. But it wasn't from the autumn air. It was something internal now. Like frost blooming beneath the skin. Slow and deliberate. He drove without music. The windows fogging faintly with each breath. The road winding ahead like a line being drawn towards something that had already claimed him. He didn't know what he expected to find behind the asylum's outer walls. But the thought had begun to press in on him like a compulsion. He had to see where they were buried, the ones whose names had been replaced by numbers, whose identities had slipped between cracks in old ledgers and charred files. He parked at the base of the hill and walked the rest of the way. No tours ran on weekdays. The gates were chained, but the fencing was loose along the north edge. He slipped through easily, following a dirt path overgrown with yellowing weeds and cracked by tree roots. The asylum loomed beside him as he walked, a silent behemoth of stone and shadow. Its windows stared down at him without blinking. The air thickened with every step he took behind the main structure, as if he were walking deeper into memory, not space. When he finally reached the rear grounds, he stopped. It was not what he expected. There were no headstones, not in the traditional sense. The field was uneven, marked by weathered wooden crosses, many broken or half buried, and a few flat metal plaques so rusted the inscriptions had turned to dust. A small wooden sign nailed to a fence post read "Patient Burial Ground" in shipping white paint. Beyond it, silence stretched. It was the kind of silence that hadn't come from absence, but from being forcibly imposed, like a held breath that had lasted decades. He moved carefully between the markers, some no taller than his shin. The air smelled of damp soil and old iron. A few markers still bore initials MTEJ, but most were blank, unnamed, unclaimed, forgotten. At the far edge of the field, beneath a sycamore tree half dead with rot, he saw something that made him pause. It was a leather-bound book, partially buried in the earth. A corner jutted out from beneath a tangle of roots and dead leaves. The leather was cracked, but the spine intact. He dropped to one knee, brushed the debris aside, and pulled it loose with a careful tug. The cover bore no title, only faint indentations from long faded handwriting. He opened it gently. The first page read, "K. Bell, Ward Nurse, 1955. Rowan's heart pounded. He turned the pages slowly. Inside were notes. Not official records, but personal entries, observations, sketches of patients' faces, fragments of overheard conversations. One page stood out. "Room 312, they brought in another one. Quiet. Doesn't eat unless told. Same as before. No name. Only a number. When I ask, he stares like he's waiting for me to remember something I never knew." Beneath that, scrawled in different ink and shakier handwriting, "They forget who they are, but not what was taken." As he read, a low sound echoed behind him. He froze. It had not come from the trees, not from the wind. It came from inside him. A whisper, soft, breathy. "Sycamore." He stood too fast, nearly dropped the book. He spun around, scanning the field. Empty. Still. "Who's there?" he said aloud before realizing he wasn't asking anyone outside of himself. The voice had not come through his ears. It had come through his mind. He clutched the journal and stumbled back toward the main building, heart pounding. With each step, more fragments rose. Cold hands. He took it. "We're still here." He reached the fencing and scrambled through the loose section, dirt smearing his coat. When he reached the truck, he climbed in and slammed the door, breathing hard. The whispering stopped. He looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face was pale, eyes wild. But something else caught his attention. There were words traced faintly in the condensation on the inside of the windshield. He hadn't seen them before. He hadn't written them. 3 words. "Do not forget." Rowan didn't remember the drive back to town. The miles blurred, lost beneath the rhythm of the engine and the disjointed fragments pulsing in his head like static. When he arrived at the boarding house, dusk had already deepened into evening, painting the front porch in tones of rust and violet. He didn't go inside immediately. Instead, he sat in the parked truck with the nurse's journal resting on the passenger seat beside him. His hand hovered over it, reluctant to touch it again, as if holding it too long might allow something inside the pages to pass into him through the skin. Eventually, the porch light blinked on. Martha appeared in the window, glanced toward the driveway, and then disappeared again without waving. Rowan exhaled and forced himself out of the truck. He tucked the journal into his coat and climbed the stairs. As soon as he stepped into the hallway, he knew someone was waiting. Professor Hines sat at the kitchen table, hands folded neatly, a cup of tea steaming in front of him. He didn't smile. He simply looked at Rowan, eyes patient, like a man who had been there for hours and had no intention of leaving until he was finished. "I stopped by earlier," Hines said calmly. "Martha let me in." I told her I was checking on your progress. Rowan closed the door behind him. You didn't have to do that. On the contrary. With a topic this obscure, I worry my students might get discouraged when the trail goes cold. Rowan walked past him, straight to the sink, and poured himself a glass of water to buy time. His back to the professor. He said, "It hasn't gone cold." "No?" Heinz's voice was neutral, but too even. "Have you found something?" Rowan sipped the water, then turned slowly. "I went to the archives. Found news clippings about rehomed patients. Some addresses repeated. Same phrases in every article." Heinz nodded. "Yes. Standard language for those days. Placement facilities often used pre-approved blurbs to avoid drawing attention. Privacy was a concern. And the burial field," Rowan added. "No names. No records. No real headstones." "That's unfortunately common." "I also found a journal," Rowan said carefully. "From a nurse. Catherine Bell. She worked there during the time period I'm researching." Heinz leaned forward. "May I see it?" Rowan hesitated for half a second, too long. Heinz noticed. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture stiffened. "Rowan," he said slowly, "if you've found original documents, they could be crucial. Especially first-hand observations." "I need to read more of it first," Rowan said. "Make sure it's relevant." Heinz sat back. "Of course. I trust your judgment. But remember, you're not just documenting names. You're documenting erasure. That kind of research only works if you let the silence speak." With that, he stood, finished his tea in one long sip, and placed the empty cup in the sink without another word. He nodded once toward Rowan, then walked out into the dark. The front door closed behind him with a soft click. Rowan stood in the kitchen, his pulse racing faster than he understood. He took the journal from his coat and carried it upstairs to his attic room. He locked the door, not out of paranoia, but instinct. He opened the book again. More entries followed, dated weeks apart. Catherine had been detailed, observant, but the entries grew increasingly disjointed. She described patient centering with no names, no histories, and an inability to recall even their own voices. She mentioned room 312 repeatedly, at first clinically, then urgently. "There is something wrong in that room," she wrote. "It's not the patient. It's the air, the stillness. Even when it's empty, I hear someone breathing." Later, the handwriting shifted, shaky, frantic. "They told me a story today. Not in words. In my sleep. They stood beside my bed and whispered things I never knew. Faces I've never seen. But I knew them." Rowan sat back in his chair and stared at the page. He closed the book and placed it under his pillow. He didn't know why. Maybe it made him feel safer. Maybe he wanted it close when he dreamed again. That night, sleep came without warning. The room in the dream was different now. It was not the asylum. It was a cottage. Simple. Wooden beams and stone floors. A hearth that hadn't been lit in weeks. A woman stood near the window, her back turned, brushing her hair in long, deliberate strokes. Rowan tried to speak, but no sound came. He walked toward her slowly. She turned her head, not fully, just enough to show the outline of her cheek. She was the same woman from before, the one with the eyes like voids. But this time, she had color, skin the hue of late autumn wheat, a grey dress smudged at the sleeves. Her lips moved, but the words arrived in Rowan's mind. "I was taken, not by chains, not by men, by silence." She turned toward him completely. Her eyes were not black now. They were his. Familiar. Terrifying. "I remembered too much," she said. "And they made me forget." Rowan woke choking on his breath. The room was cold. The radiator had shut off again. Wind whistled faintly outside, though the trees did not move. He sat up, hands trembling, and turned on the lamp. There, on the pillow beside him, The journal lay open. He was certain he had closed it. The page now visible was blank, except for a single line in fresh ink. "You are not alone in here." The following day brought no clarity. Only questions that thickened like smoke in a locked room. Rowan awoke exhausted. His limbs heavy as if he had carried someone else's weight all night. The journal remained where it had been, still open. Still turned to the same ominous line. "You are not alone in here." He stared at it for a long while before closing the cover and sliding it into the drawer of the nightstand. Not to hide it. Not truly. But to delay the moment he would have to face it again. He showered, dressed, and stepped outside. The world seemed off by just a degree, colors dimmer, shapes slightly warped at the edges. Weston looked the same as it had the day before. Yet he felt like he was walking through a version of it rendered from memory. Not reality. The people he passed on the sidewalk had faces that flickered, first neutral, then briefly someone he almost recognized. Then back to strangers again. A woman with auburn hair glanced at him in the bakery window. Her eyes matched a photograph he had seen in the asylum's records, Eliza Morgan. 1957. But Eliza had died in 1961. At a crosswalk. A man nodded politely. His face meant nothing to Rowan, until it meant everything. A name bubbled up from nowhere. Samuel Thorne. He had written it down weeks ago while researching the lost patient list. It wasn't a common name. And yet Rowan was sure of it. The man walked past him, continued down the block, and disappeared into the crowd. His chest tightened. A pressure that had nothing to do with panic and everything to do with intrusion. Something was seeping in, sliding behind his thoughts. He blinked, trying to shake it off. But when he reached for his phone to check the time, the background image was no longer the mountain trail photo he remembered taking, it was a photograph of the asylum. Nighttime. Blurred at the edges. The windows glowing faintly. He didn't remember setting that image. He didn't remember ever seeing it. He locked the screen quickly and shoved the phone into his pocket. That evening, he returned to his room early, stomach untouched by hunger. He hadn't eaten since the day before. But the idea of food was foreign now. Hollow. He paced the attic room with the journal unopened on the desk. The longer he resisted it, the louder it seemed to call. He knew the voice wasn't real, at least. Not in the way people defined real. It had no echo, no direction, no traceable sound. It rose from thought, from memory that didn't belong to him. At some point, he sat down and opened the book again. New pages had appeared. Not filled in, not truly. But someone, at some point, had scrawled names into the margins. Names he had seen before on discharge slips, on old rosters, in footnotes of reports written by men who had never set foot inside a patient's room. Annalise Greer, Tobias Wells, Henry M. Withers, Rowan Hatcher. That last name hit him hardest. Not just for its familiarity, but for the placement. It wasn't written like the others. It was underlined. Once, twice, and then, beneath it, in different handwriting, "You've worn many names. You're wearing one now." He closed the book quickly, breathing shallow, as if the act of reading had drawn something closer. That night, he didn't sleep, not truly. He lay in bed, half aware, half submerged in a layer of thoughts not entirely his own. He saw flickers of hands restrained against beds, of eyes wide and searching in the dark. He heard humming, a lullaby with no language, only a rhythm of breath and ache. He heard screaming from behind doors that wouldn't open. And once, just once, he felt someone else's fingers running along the inside of his wrist, as if mapping veins, as if confirming that the body was still warm. In the early hours, he sat up and whispered to no one, "Who am I?" The radiator hissed in response. But in the mirror across the room, his reflection didn't answer, because it was no longer looking at him. It was looking just past him, toward the door, and smiling. The next morning came not as a fresh beginning, but as an extension of the night that hadn't truly ended. Rowan hadn't slept in any real sense. His body had rested. Yes. But his mind had been adrift, floating between flickers of memory, fragments of images that weren't his own, and an ache in the back of his skull that pulsed like a metronome. He moved slowly through the motions of morning, washing his face, brushing his teeth, changing his clothes. None of it felt grounded in the present. He didn't make eye contact with himself in the mirror. He feared what might be looking back, outside. The sky was the color of ash. A wind had picked up during the early hours, shaking brittle leaves from the trees and scattering them in tight, frantic spirals across the street. Rowan walked without a destination at first, but every turn brought him closer to the asylum. The old building loomed in the distance like a landmark in a dream, ever present no matter which direction he turned. Eventually, he stopped resisting. He followed the hill's curve, cut behind the boarded fence again, and found himself once more in the shadow of its vast, decaying walls. The chain on the main gate had been broken. Not recently. Rust had already eaten into the links, and the padlock hung loose. Forgotten. He pushed through the heavy front doors and stepped into the main corridor. It was colder inside than he remembered. Not just in temperature, but in sensation, as if the very air had been drained of friction. The silence was heavy, not with peace, but with the pressure of countless unsaid things. His boots echoed faintly across the cracked linoleum, the sound swallowed quickly by the long, vaulted hallway. He wandered deeper. Every corridor seemed familiar, not from photos or research, but from within, as if some part of him had once walked these very halls, counted these very steps, traced the same dust-lined baseboards with the side of his hand. He didn't know what he was looking for. Perhaps a window, a room, a face. But what he found was a hallway on the third floor that made him stop mid-step. The light was wrong. Everything was wrong. Though there was no electricity. A soft glow spilled from beneath one of the doors ahead, room 314. Not 312. But close. He approached slowly, unsure whether the tightness in his chest came from fear or recognition. The door stood ajar. He pushed it open. Inside, the room was intact. Not in the way abandoned spaces sometimes appear intact by accident, but deliberately so. The bed was made, the sheets clean. A chair sat near the window, its fabric unstained by dust. On the wall hung a single photograph in a rusted frame, an old woman, expression unreadable, standing in front of what appeared to be the very same room. Rowan stepped closer. The caption beneath the image had been written in a shaky hand, K-Bell, last rotation. 1957. He turned around. A man was standing in the hallway, not dressed in tourist clothes, not carrying gear. He wore a janitor's uniform, faded green, with no visible name tag. His face was pale and long, the skin around his mouth chapped, eyes sunk too deep into their sockets. He stared at Rowan without blinking. "You shouldn't be in here," the man said, his voice slow and low, with no inflection. Rowan opened his mouth, but no words came. "You think you're looking for answers," the man continued, stepping into the room without hesitation. "But you're not. You're remembering. That's worse." Rowan finally spoke. "Do I know you?" The man looked at him for a long time, then shook his head. "Not anymore." And then he turned and walked away. His footsteps soundless despite the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. Rowan didn't follow. He stood in that room for what felt like hours, the silence growing heavier with each breath. The photograph still hung on the wall. The bed remained perfectly made. But something about the light began to shift, as if the room were no longer content to remain within the rules of day and night. He stepped out quickly, heart hammering, and descended the stairs two at a time. The air grew colder with each floor. By the time he reached the first floor again, he could no longer hear his own footsteps. Back outside, the sky had not changed. It was still grey, still windless, but every window of the asylum behind him now appeared darkened, as if watching. He didn't look back until he reached the truck. When he finally did, The front doors were closed again, and the chain was intact, as if nothing, and no one, had passed through that threshold in decades. Rowan didn't remember the drive back to the boarding house. His hands moved on the wheel. His eyes registered traffic, turns, and the faint outlines of street signs. But none of it stayed. It was like trying to read through fog. When he pulled into the gravel drive and stepped out of the truck, his legs trembled, not from fatigue, but from the deep, unspeakable unease coiled in his spine. Something had followed him, not in body, not in footsteps, but in recognition. The asylum had not released him. It had marked him inside. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. But no longer in a way he could pretend was natural. He moved quickly, up the stairs and into the attic room, locking the door behind him before he'd even dropped his bag. The air in the room felt wrong. The smell was different. Older. Less like dust and old wood. And more like paper that had been buried, then unearthed, something sour. Something that remembered dampness and decay. He approached the nightstand where he had last stored Catherine's journal, only to find it already resting on the desk. Open. Face down. As though someone, or something, had been reading it in his absence. He lifted it slowly. Palms suddenly damp. The page it fell open to was not familiar. He had read the entire journal twice. This one had not been there before. The date was missing. But the handwriting was undoubtedly Catherine's, although shakier than before. The strokes hesitant, as if written by candlelight or by a hand that no longer trusted itself. They told me to forget. They made me watch while they did it. The machine hummed. And the voices faded. But even as I write this, I can still hear them, just beneath the silence. They are not angry. They are waiting. Rowan read the lines again and again. Something cold settling behind his eyes. He flipped the page. Blank. He flipped another. Still blank. Then, suddenly, on the inside back cover, another sentence had been scrawled in graphite. Smaller. Almost imperceptible. You're writing this, Rowan. His breath caught. He stood quickly, the journal slipping from his fingers and hitting the floor with a muted slap. The room pulsed around him, warping slightly at the edges. He pressed his palms against his temples and tried to breathe. But the air felt too thick. Each inhale tasted of something metallic, like breath exhaled by old copper. A sharp pain shot through his skull, sudden and precise, as though a needle had been driven just behind his eye. His vision blurred, not with darkness, but with images. A series of flashes. Not quite still. Not quite motion. A hospital bed. Leather restraints. A ceiling fan with two blades spinning slower than gravity should allow. A hand on his chest. Feminine. Trembling. And then a voice. Not his. Not Catherine's. But rising from within his own throat. I didn't mean to stay this long. He fell to his knees. It passed just as quickly as it had come, leaving him gasping and soaked with sweat. The floor beneath his hands felt cold. The journal still lay open beside him, pages fluttering in the breeze from the cracked window. Except the window hadn't been cracked open earlier. He was certain of that. He stood shakily, closed it with a shaking hand, and backed away from the desk. He wanted to say it out loud, that it was stress, that he hadn't slept, that his mind was playing tricks on him, but the words would not come, because they would be lies. And something inside him refused to lie, even to himself. He sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the closed journal, afraid to touch it again. He was no longer reading the past. He was inside it. And the walls between then and now were thinning. The building that housed the town's archive stood just beyond the courthouse, a squat stone structure with faded windows and a single lamp flickering above the door like a tired sentinel. Rowan hesitated outside for several minutes before going in, his hand resting on the brass doorknob that had grown cold under the overcast sky. He knew what he was searching for, though he couldn't put it into words. He wasn't even sure he wanted to find it. But the alternative, turning around, pretending this wasn't happening, had already slipped beyond possibility. He crossed the threshold. Inside, the air was dry, stale, and tinged with something that reminded him of old clothing left too long in a sealed trunk. The woman behind the front desk looked up from her tea with mild interest. She wore half-moon glasses and a knitted shawl. Her hair pulled into a bun so tight it made her expression seem more severe than it likely was. Rowan approached and explained, as evenly as he could, that he was working on a thesis involving patient identity from Trans-Allegheny in the 1950s. He asked if she might have records, non-digitized, municipal, any documents that had survived the fire. Her expression didn't change. She asked for a date range and a list of names. He provided both. She pointed him toward the second floor and unlocked a file room without another word. He thanked her and climbed the narrow staircase, his footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet. The file room was larger than he'd expected. Rows of metal cabinets stretched from wall to wall, each drawer labeled by year and subject matter. The air inside was cooler, but not fresher. He moved to the section marked 1955 to 1965 and began methodically pulling drawers. Most of the folders were tax records, property disputes, employment listings, nothing relevant. But tucked in the back of a drawer labeled Public Institutions, he found a brown folder with no printed title. Only a penciled notation, Reint. Patients, final phase, internal use. He opened it with careful fingers. Inside were several pages of names. Most typed, some crossed out. He scanned them, heart quickening. Each entry had a patient ID, a room number, and a final note, reintegrated. Room 312 appeared 5 times. One of the entries had no name, just a set of initials, RH, followed by a date, the 26th of October 1958. Rowan froze. Those were his initials. He checked the birth date. It didn't match his own. It listed a year 30 years too early. But the name field had been changed. Someone had written over it, once in red ink, then crossed it out and replaced it with pencil. The ink had bled over time, making the original illegible. The penciled version read, Rowan Hatcher. He stared at the page. A drop of sweat slid down his back. He felt, for a moment, the strange dislocation of standing not in a room, but inside someone else's skin. His name should not be here. He had never been admitted, never lived in Weston before this research. He had no relatives outside of those he'd already traced. But this document didn't care what he believed. It stated, calmly, plainly, bureaucratically, that he had once been a patient. He closed the folder, but didn't return it. He took it with him, downstairs. The woman at the desk didn't look up. Rowan nodded as he passed, the folder now tucked inside his coat. He stepped outside into a sky that had begun to darken even though the sun had hours left before setting. The clouds were thicker now, pressing downward. Back at the truck, he didn't turn the engine on. He sat in the driver's seat, staring at the dashboard without seeing it. Something had shifted, not just in the records. In him. There was a thread running through all of this, not just through Catherine's entries or the redacted files, but through his very presence here. As if Weston had not been a destination, but a return. As if the ground beneath his feet recognized him better than he recognized himself. He pulled out the journal again and flipped back to the back cover, half expecting the line from earlier to have vanished. It hadn't. You're writing this, Rowan. He opened the folder again, slowly, unable to stop himself. The entry for RH was still there, but now, written in the margin beside it, in handwriting that matched none of the typewritten text, another note had appeared. It read, Subject believes he is the researcher. He dropped the folder. It landed on the passenger seat without a sound. He didn't move for a long time. The folder remained untouched on the passenger seat for over an hour. Rowan didn't drive. He didn't speak. He didn't even blink for long stretches of time. He sat still, trying to make sense of the note, Subject believes he is the researcher, over and over again. Like a looped phrase stuck in a broken machine. He had no memory of ever being a patient. No record in his own files. No gaps in his timeline. His life, as he knew it, had been consistent. If unremarkable, undergraduate studies. Graduate program. Assistantship with Professor Hines. The research grant. But the note had not come from him. It had come from somewhere, or someone, who had observed him with enough distance to make such a claim. And it hadn't been typed. It had been written. Recent. Intentional. He started the engine. Instead of returning to the boarding house, he turned left at the intersection and followed the signs toward the town records office. The building sat adjacent to City Hall. Modest in size but fortified with glass doors and tinted windows. Inside, a receptionist greeted him with a distracted smile. Rowan asked to see the municipal census records. Specifically residential files from the past 12 months. He gave his name, his address, his license number. The woman typed quickly, then frowned. "There's no file under that name," she said. "Could it be under a different spelling?" He spelled it aloud. Carefully. Hatcher. Rowan Hatcher. She tried again. Still nothing. "Maybe your registration never got entered correctly?" she suggested, though her tone carried the forced politeness of someone growing uneasy. "Do you have a physical ID?" He handed her his driver's license. She examined it closely, flipped it once, then scanned it into the computer. The system beeped, but no profile came up. "That's strange," she said. "It's reading the barcode, but it's not linking to any internal database." "Can you check the DMV records?" he asked. "Statewide?" She hesitated, then nodded. Several more minutes passed. Finally, she looked up. Brow furrowed. "There's no registration history under this number. It's formatted correctly. But there's no file. No issuance date. It's not flagged as fraudulent. It's just absent." Rowan took the ID back, his hand unsteady. "I've been staying at the boarding house on Wren Street," he said quietly. "Martha Coombs. She would have logged my name when I checked in." The receptionist shook her head gently. "We don't handle private lodging records. But if there's no utility registration or municipal listing under your name, we can't verify your presence here." He thanked her and stepped outside. The wind had picked up. The trees bent with it, shedding dry leaves that scattered along the sidewalk like fragments of thought. He stood still, watching the motion, trying to feel something solid beneath him, pavement, air, even his own weight, but everything felt loose, as if he were standing inside a version of the town rendered just for him. And whoever was writing in the margins was now slowly erasing him line by line. He walked for a long time without direction. Each corner of Weston felt the same. The storefronts repeated. The street names blended. At some point he passed the bakery for the third time. The woman with the auburn hair was no longer inside. Her reflection no longer waited for him in the glass. By dusk, he found himself standing once more at the foot of the hill. The asylum loomed, distant but distinct. Its windows dark and fixed. A single crow circled above it, slow and deliberate. The air grew colder with each breath he took, but he didn't retreat. He stood there, staring upward, and wondered, not for the first time, if the building had built itself around him. Nightfall brought with it no true darkness, only a dim, suspended haze that made everything feel like a scene unfolding behind a sheet of frost. Rowan drifted through the streets without direction, his legs moving out of habit while his mind struggled to keep pace. The buildings around him wore familiar faces, but each corner turned revealed a detail slightly askew, a storefront with no signage, a street lamp that flickered too rhythmically, a mailbox that seemed to vanish and reappear when he looked away. The sensation of unreality had grown so thick that even the crunch of leaves beneath his boots began to sound artificial, like a memory being played back at the wrong speed. When he arrived at the boarding house, he no longer felt the cold. His body acknowledged it. But his skin had become indifferent. He climbed the stairs, unlocked the attic door with shaking fingers, and stepped into the room that had once been his shelter. Now, it felt too quiet. Not peaceful, vacant. The kind of silence that came only after something had already passed through. Nothing had been moved. And yet the air carried a charge. As though his absence had been observed by something that now waited for his return. He approached the desk and opened Catherine's journal again. Not with curiosity, but resignation. A new entry had appeared, not dated, but written in a hand that had deteriorated into small, pressured loops. It described a moment Catherine had once dismissed as exhaustion. She had looked into a mirror and seen her own eyes watching her from the wrong angle. The face was hers, but the thoughts it held were not. She wrote that the reflection had blinked a half-second too late and smiled when she did not. Rowan closed the journal carefully and rose from his chair to stand before the mirror near the window. He studied his own face, not just the features, but the stillness behind them. For a moment, he held his breath. The reflection did the same. But then it seemed to hold it longer than he did. As though it had no need to breathe unless instructed. He looked away and stepped back. But the impression of delay remained with him. He did not sleep that night. He remained upright for hours. Too tense to lie down. Too distant to read. The only sounds were the low groans of the old building settling. The occasional rattle of wind against the roof. And the irregular thudding of his pulse inside his skull. He began pacing without noticing, 10 steps to the door. 10 steps back to the window, until sometime before dawn. When something finally broke the monotony. From below the floorboards came a sound, faint, muffled, unmistakably human. It was a voice. His own. Speaking a sentence he had only read once and never spoken aloud. "You're writing this, Rowan." The words were not imagined. They were not internal. They traveled through air, through wood, rising up from beneath him as if the house had begun to remember in his voice. He dropped to his knees and pressed his ear to the floor, his cheek against the cold surface. The voice repeated the sentence exactly, as though on cue. He pushed himself upright, trembling now not from fear, but from something colder, recognition. He crossed the room and grabbed both the journal and the folder, shoved them into his coat, and hurried down the stairs. The kitchen light was already on. Martha stood by the stove, humming softly as she poured coffee into a chipped ceramic cup. He opened his mouth to speak, to ask if she had heard anything from the attic. But when she turned to face him, she wore an expression he hadn't seen before, distant, vaguely polite, devoid of familiarity. She greeted him like a stranger. Her voice flat and unbothered. Had she forgotten him? Or had she never known him at all? He sat down at the table out of habit, unsure what else to do with his hands, and listened in silence as she continued to hum. The melody was unfamiliar, but something about the rhythm pulled at him. The tune wasn't being hummed in her voice. Not really. The tone, the phrasing, the slight rasp at the end of each phrase, it mirrored his own voice too perfectly to dismiss. She smiled as if nothing were wrong. He watched her mouth closely, watched the air pass between her lips, and realized with horrifying clarity that the sounds filling the kitchen were not hers. It was his voice, projected through her breath, looping a song he had never sung. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, and she didn't flinch. She didn't even stop humming. He backed out of the room, journal clenched tight in one hand, folder under the other arm, and stepped outside. The wind met him like a tide, sharpened without welcome. He walked fast, then faster, as if his own legs feared what would happen if he slowed. Every window he passed seemed too dark, every reflection too late. The town no longer moved around him, it rotated, subtle and slow, like a stage turning just out of sync. His heart beat heavy against his ribs, not in panic, but in protest, as if his body knew it had carried too many memories that did not belong to him. His thoughts began to slip again, phrases repeating themselves, places folding into one another. And for a brief moment, he couldn't remember which version of himself had stepped into Weston first, the man who came to study, or the man who had already been here all along. Rowan had no recollection of making the decision to return to the asylum. There was no internal debate, no chain of logic. He was simply walking, already halfway up the hill before he realized where his feet had taken him. The iron gate stood open, not wide enough to be welcoming, but no longer resisting his presence. Wind pushed past the entrance like breath escaping a narrow mouth. The trees lining the path didn't sway so much as lean, their trunks bent as if they'd grown in response to something ancient and pressing. The front doors gave way with less effort than before. Inside, the air had lost its stagnant weight. It now carried a faint hum, too quiet to be mechanical, too steady to be natural. Rowan crossed the main lobby, moving without urgency, but with the weight of someone arriving at the inevitable. The stairwell greeted him like a corridor between thoughts, dust rising in thin spirals with each step he climbed. The third floor unfolded without resistance. It had memorized his footsteps. Room 312 waited at the end of the hall, unmarked, yet unmissable. The door bore no number. The wood had deepened in color since he'd last seen it, as if absorbing something with time. He raised his hand and pressed it against the surface. It didn't feel cold. It felt like skin left too long in shadow, retaining warmth, but without life. He pushed gently, and the door opened inward with a long exhale of stale air. The room was not like the others. It was neither preserved nor ruined. It simply existed as a container for something that had long outlived its purpose. The bed frame remained. Rust curled along its joints. The mattress had collapsed, sunken in the center, as if someone had lain there long enough to become a fixture of the room. The paint on the walls had peeled in sheets, revealing discolored layers beneath that formed the faint outline of a human figure, arms extended, head bowed. Dust coated every surface, except for a small patch at the far corner of the floor, where it had been disturbed in a precise square, no larger than a journal. Rowan stepped forward, his eyes drawn to the cot. He reached down, brushed the edge of the bed frame, and felt something beneath his fingertips, shallow carvings, etched by repetition, not force. Letters. He tilted his head, reading them slowly, RH, and beside those, in fainter lines, KB. He stared at them for a long time, his breath quiet in his throat. He had never been in this room before, and yet his name was there. Not a name like his, not similar. His initials, carved into the bed frame of a place that predated his memory, but not, apparently, his presence. He sat down on the edge of the frame, not carefully, not ceremonially, simply as if he had done so before. The air inside the room grew denser, not from dust, but from compression, like sound being muted just before a word is spoken. He set the journal beside him, though he had no intention of opening it. What he needed was not inside the pages. Not anymore. The room did not shift. It did not whisper. It waited. And in the stillness that followed, Rowan did not feel afraid. He felt recognized. There was no change in light, no sudden chill. The walls did not close in, but something passed through the space, not across the room, but through his thoughts. A memory arrived that didn't belong to him, yet unfolded with the intimacy of a lived moment. A bed under two bright lights, a figure seated beside him, the grip of leather against his wrist, and the sound of his own name spoken by someone who expected him not to remember it. His hands clenched without command. The image flickered. He blinked and saw only the empty room. Yet the feeling remained. He hadn't found evidence. He hadn't uncovered history. He had touched a thread, and the thread had pulled back. Rowan rose slowly, left the journal where it lay, and stepped toward the doorway. He didn't close the door behind him. He didn't look back to confirm what was real. The hallway received him without judgment. The stairs groaned softly beneath his weight, but did not resist. By the time he stepped back into the outside air, The sky had begun to shift in color, not to sunset, not to dusk, but to something in between. Like the pause between a breath in and a breath out. He walked downhill as the building behind him faded into the fog. Not in distance, but in definition. It no longer loomed. It receded. Not because it was done with him, but because it no longer needed to watch. When Rowan returned to his room, he did not take off his coat. He stood by the window for a long time, watching the branches sway in the wind. Though there was no wind that he could feel, the lamp in the corner had been left on, casting a thin line of light across the desk, where the journal still lay exactly as he had left it. Yet something about the posture of the book on the surface suggested it had not remained untouched. He stepped forward and picked it up with both hands, letting the cover fall open without forcing it. The pages turned as though guided by breath rather than fingers, stopping not at a bookmarked place, but somewhere unfamiliar. The writing he found was not new in ink, but new in presence. It was his handwriting, unmistakable in form, spacing, and weight. There was no doubt. He recognized the particular way he looped his G's, the inconsistent angles of his capital T's, the small flaw in the tail of his Y's. But he had no memory of having written the words now before him. They were phrases, scattered across the page in broken progression, like observations made during a dream and transcribed without interpretation. Some lines were nearly poetic, but none felt intentional. One passage read, "We return not by choice, but by the shape that waits in silence." Another, "If a room remembers you, how do you leave it?" He turned the page. The ink here appeared fresher, though not enough to bleed. Another sentence stretched across the top in a version of his hand that looked slightly rushed, as if written without full attention. "You are watching the act of forgetting from inside the memory." The words unsettled him not because of what they said, but because of the quiet confidence in how they were placed, as if the writer had not intended to discover anything, but to confirm something already known. He looked to the desk and saw his pen resting where he had left it, uncapped. Its barrel turned slightly toward the edge. He reached for it and held it loosely. It felt warm, though he had not touched it in hours. Setting it aside, he retrieved his field notebook, flipped to a blank page, and placed his hand flat on the paper. Not pressing, not guiding, just resting. He did not expect movement, nor did he believe in the dramatic. But what followed was not movement in the physical sense. It was a sensation, subtle and precise, as though the nerves beneath his skin were aligning themselves to a gesture not yet made. There was no writing, but his hand no longer felt entirely his. He stood and walked to the mirror, no longer to test what it might reveal, but simply to anchor his perception in the shape of his own body. His reflection greeted him with passive symmetry. The face, the shoulders, the coat, all as they should be. But his eyes resisted focus. They met his gaze and held it, but the stillness behind them lacked agreement. He turned away and returned to the desk. Opening the journal again, the page had changed. Another line had appeared at the bottom. In his own hand, "It writes when you look away." He did not respond, nor did he close the book. He watched the sentence for some time, waiting for it to mean more than it said. Eventually, he set the journal aside and opened his laptop. The screen lit his face in the window's reflection. He created a new document, typed his name, paused, then typed it again. The letters appeared correct. The spelling matched, but the act felt like rehearsing rather than remembering. He stared at the cursor blinking behind the last letter, not because he had forgotten what to write, but because he had never questioned the act of naming himself until now. He closed the file without saving and shut the computer. The room remained still, but the silence had shifted. It was no longer empty, but occupied. Not by sound, not by presence, but by continuity. He crossed to the bed, sat without removing his coat, and placed the journal on his lap, letting it rest there without opening it again. His hands were still outside. The wind finally reached the window pane with a dry scrape. He did not move. The next morning unfolded without intention. Rowan had not slept, but his body had entered a state close enough that time passed without measurement. The light that crept into the attic room was pale and undemanding, filtered through a layer of low-hanging cloud that dimmed the outlines of the trees outside. He moved slowly, avoiding the mirror, bypassing the desk. Not because he feared what might appear, but because he no longer trusted those surfaces to reflect only what was present. Instead, he took the journal, placed it into the satchel he used during research trips, and left the house without breakfast or a destination clearly formed in his mind. The library stood closed for the day, its windows shuttered due to maintenance. The post office carried no new records. The bakery had changed its window display, but the faces of the staff behind the counter remained unfamiliar. He passed them all as though walking through a town he had once known in photographs. Finally, at the edge of the municipal complex, he found a sign he had not noticed before, though it must have been there all along: Western Retirement Home, visitors welcome until 5 p.m. There was no reason to go in, no appointment, no inquiry, but his feet carried him forward, and his hand reached for the door. Inside, the space was muted, not quiet, not sterile, but dulled, like voices behind glass or memories caught mid-turn. A woman at the front desk asked for his name. He gave it, but she did not write it down. Instead, she asked who he was here to see. He admitted that he wasn't sure, only that he was conducting research into long-term staff or residents who had worked near the asylum grounds. She nodded once, slowly, then gestured down the right hallway. "She's awake today," the woman said. "She doesn't talk much, but sometimes she knows things." Rowan followed the corridor, passing framed prints of Appalachian hills and flowers that no longer grew in this season. At the end of the hall, beside a window without a view, sat a woman in a green shawl, her hands resting motionless on a folded blanket. Her hair was thin and white, her skin creased and translucent, and her eyes, though milky with age, held a trace of something intact. He approached quietly and stood without speaking. She looked up. "You came back," she said, not as a question. Rowan hesitated. "Do I know you?" She shook her head once, gently. "Not in the way people mean. But you were here before. Long ago." He knelt beside her chair. "When?" She didn't answer at first. Instead, her eyes drifted toward the window, where the bare trees outside scratched against a sky the color of soot. "I was still working in admissions when they brought you in. Quiet boy. Not much older than 20. Though no one could ever confirm your papers. You didn't speak for weeks. And when you did, it was never in the present tense." Rowan stared at her, searching her face for confusion or familiarity, but found neither. "You're saying I was a patient?" "You were a presence," she said. "They didn't know what to do with you. You were never violent. You didn't resist. But the doctors were. Unsettled. You knew things before they happened. Finished their sentences. Drew floor plans you couldn't have seen." He opened the journal and showed her the handwriting. "Is this mine?" She looked at it closely. "Yes." He closed the book, hands steady but cold. "This was dated in 1958. She nodded again. "That sounds right. I wasn't born until 1989. Not everything comes in order," she replied. They sat in silence for several minutes. A nurse passed at the end of the hallway and waved politely. The old woman didn't move. Her hands remained folded, her breath shallow, but even. Rowan asked, quietly, "Why are you still here?" She answered without blinking. "Someone has to remember you." He stood slowly, unsure whether the cold that had settled in his chest came from the air or from the part of his mind that now held her words like weight. He thanked her, though she gave no sign of hearing. As he turned to go, she spoke once more, voice nearly lost beneath the hum of the corridor. "You don't have to stay in their story. But you can't leave if you don't know which parts they gave you." Outside, the sky had darkened further. He walked back to the truck with the journal clutched tightly against his side. Not to protect it, but to feel the pressure of something real beneath his arm. He packed at dusk. Not quickly, but with methodical gestures that left little room for doubt. The journal. The folder from the archives. The small notebook where he had once jotted questions he no longer recognized, all of it went into his satchel. He zipped it closed and rested both hands on the surface, steadying himself. The room remained quiet behind him, offering no argument, no resistance. It no longer needed to speak. Its silence had already done what words could not. He descended the stairs without encountering Martha. The kitchen light was off. The hallway dim. Outside, the street lamps had not yet flickered on, and the last color had drained from the sky. He placed his bag in the passenger seat, turned the key in the ignition, and let the engine settle into a low, expectant hum. Gravel shifted beneath the tires as he backed out of the narrow driveway and turned toward the main road. His plan, if it could be called that, was simple. He would leave Weston, drive west until the town no longer appeared in his rearview mirror, find a place with no connection to the name Hatcher, to the asylum, to any voice that knew how to pronounce the silence he had begun to carry. He passed the post office, the library, the church with its leaning steeple. The bakery's lights were still on. The woman with auburn hair was not in the window. The road bent left, then opened into a long stretch flanked by pine and field. He took it, driving past the outer limits of what he remembered, past the signs he had once used to orient himself. The sky grew darker. No stars appeared. Trees passed in slow rhythm, and his fingers tightened around the wheel. Not from fear, but from the pressure of having to hold direction in a place where distance no longer behaved. He drove for 23 minutes before the town reappeared. At first, he didn't believe it. The brick sign bearing Weston's name. The small gas station with the warped roof. The municipal truck idling at the corner. They greeted him without shame or announcement. He slowed, turned down a side street, looped twice, and found himself once again facing the road out of town. He tried a different direction. He passed the retirement home, the firehouse, a set of unfamiliar houses with boarded windows. The road curved again. 15 minutes later, he emerged near the courthouse. A clock tower read the same hour he had left. He pulled over, turned off the engine, sat in the dark. There was no panic, no outburst. Only the deep, even rhythm of a realization arriving where logic had failed. He was not being turned around. He was not making errors in direction. The roads themselves had changed. Not in shape, but in function. They no longer led out. They now curved inward, slow and imperceptible. Designed not to confuse, but to encircle. He stepped out of the truck and let the door close behind him. The night air was thin, but not cold. It held no scent. The town around him gave no sign that it noticed his presence. Yet each window he passed reflected his figure not just once, but layered, slightly behind, slightly ahead, like frames of film misaligned. He crossed the street, paused at a bench outside the newspaper office, and sat. The building had long since stopped printing. The blinds were drawn. But in the stillness that followed, he felt a shape take form, not beside him, not in front of him, but behind his thoughts. He could no longer tell whether the memories rising in his head were his. He saw flashes of a childhood that did not belong to him, a red bicycle, a gravel road near an orchard, the taste of metal from a swing set in summer heat. He remembered the texture of a flannel shirt he had never worn, a voice calling a name that was not Rowan. A hospital hallway lined with orange tiles. These were not dreams. They came with sensory weight, complete with smell, sound, and the faint ache of regret attached to something long gone. He closed his eyes and tried to focus on a single moment from his own life, his first day at university. The sound of his father's voice, the name of a friend he had once trusted. But each recollection arrived blurred, partial. as though they were photos left out in the rain. The edges bled into other people's moments. The distinction between self and subject eroded like ink underwater. He opened his eyes and found the town unchanged. Nothing had moved, but he no longer knew which parts of it were remembering him, and which parts he was now remembering in return. The phone rang shortly after midnight. Rowan had not returned to the boarding house. Instead, he had parked beside the old water tower and remained inside the truck with the windows fogged and the engine silent. The key was in the ignition, but he had not turned it since his last attempt to leave the town had failed. The journal lay unopened beside him on the passenger seat, its spine worn from repeated handling. He had not written anything in it since the morning, but the weight of the object had changed. Not in mass, but in presence. The phone vibrated once, then rang again. He looked at the screen. No number. No caller ID. No location. He let it ring 4 times, each chime sounding further away than the last, before finally lifting the device and pressing it to his ear without speaking. The silence on the other end was not complete. It carried the faint sound of air passing through a space too narrow, too smooth. Then, a voice emerged. Calm. Unhurried. It was his own. "You were looking for them," it said. "But they were already writing through you." He didn't respond. The voice did not repeat itself. Instead, it shifted in tone, still his voice, but slightly younger, clearer, as if recorded before exhaustion had dulled the edges. It began reciting lines he recognized, not from conversation, but from the journal. Sentences he had written alone in his room. Phrases he had composed silently without ever speaking aloud. The voice listed them one by one, in no order, no context. "You're not the last patient. You're the first echo." They read you like you were already archived. Sometimes the walls are not for keeping out. Sometimes they remember too much. Each line struck with precision, not because of its content, but because it arrived from outside, stripped of authorship. The voice continued for nearly a minute before stopping abruptly. Then silence. No click. No disconnection. Just absence. Rowan slowly lowered the phone, not ending the call, only moving the device away from his ear. The screen remained lit. The timer showed the call was still active. He set it down on the console and turned his head toward the windshield. The glass reflected nothing. Not the dashboard lights. Not his face. Only black. He turned on the overhead cabin light. The reflection returned, weak but visible. He saw his eyes in the mirror above the visor, but something behind the stare lacked resonance. He looked tired, but the fatigue no longer felt like his alone. It had accumulated, layered itself in increments he could not trace. He picked up the journal, opened to the middle, and placed it across the steering wheel. There, between 2 old entries, a line had appeared. It was handwritten in ink identical to his, though the strokes wavered slightly more than usual. It said, "He hears himself before he answers." He flipped forward. More lines. None familiar. Some were questions he remembered considering but had never committed to paper. Others were sentences constructed in rhythms he had never used but could not deny came from him. They weren't memories. They weren't predictions. They were iterations, refinements of thoughts that had been passed through something else before returning to him altered. He closed the journal and leaned back in the seat. Outside, the wind picked up. The trees around the tower shifted slightly. Far above him, the rusted scaffold let out a single creak, not in warning, but in acknowledgement. The phone, still lit on the console, blinked twice and ended the call on its own. The screen returned to idle. No record of the number remained. He sat motionless for a long time. Not because he had nowhere to go, but because he no longer trusted his arrival would be his own. He could still move, still breathe, still reach for the wheel. But the space between action and intent had begun to stretch, like film caught between projectors. He looked at his hands and wondered whether the memory of using them still belonged entirely to him. Rowan remained seated long after the light outside had dimmed into that indistinct hour when neither night nor morning could claim the sky. The journal was closed in front of him, though its presence had not diminished. It pressed against his awareness in the same way a door can carry the memory of footsteps long after the corridor has gone silent. He had not added to its pages. He no longer trusted what might follow his pen. Instead, he let the silence build around him, allowed the weight of the past days to collect without pausing. He did not look in the mirror, though it stood clear in the corner. Nor did he revisit the notebook in his bag, which now seemed to contain more than it ever had space for. What he did, instead, was examine the desk as a surface. A simple wooden plane that had become the site of too many crossings, between time, identity, intention. The grain in the wood no longer looked familiar. It seemed older than the room itself, as if salvaged from another place, another function. He let his hand rest there. He had reached a point beyond understanding. Not because he had accepted the absence of answers, but because the structure of the questions had begun to break down. The idea of what happened here no longer applied. Nor did who was I or how do I leave. Each had been eroded by too many perspectives, by layers of memory that did not belong to a single person, and yet had settled inside him as though waiting for someone to carry them forward. Across the room, the window had begun to pale, not from the rising sun, but from a kind of ambient exposure, an undirected brightness that flattened depth. The streets outside remained still. The bakery's awning no longer moved. The silhouette that had once appeared there had vanished or perhaps never stood at all. The town did not feel absent. It felt watchful, but without malice, like a painting hung to be observed rather than understood. He returned his attention to the journal, its cover worn at the corners. He did not open it. The last entry he remembered writing was already suspect, and he feared that any further engagement would shift it again. He needed the page to stay closed, not as a finality, but as an acknowledgement that some boundaries should remain unconfirmed. Rising from the desk required effort, though not from fatigue. His limbs moved with a delay that had not been present before. As he crossed the room, he passed the mirror and allowed himself one glance. The reflection met him without resistance, but the eyes it held offered no insistence of recognition. He looked away without judgment. At the door, his hand found the knob with the ease of habit, though the motion felt more rehearsed than remembered. He stepped into the hallway without checking the time. The house did not respond. No stair creaked underfoot. No draft stirred the edge of the runner. The air carried no warmth, but it did not press against him. It permitted him to pass. At the bottom of the stairs, the front door remained unlocked. The night outside softened into a colorless blur. He crossed the threshold and walked into the street. Each house he passed resembled another he had seen. The roads folded back on themselves in ways he no longer questioned. He walked not to escape, but to settle. The question was no longer where he belonged, but how much of him remained distinct enough to require belonging. The voice that had spoken through the phone had not been a warning. It had been a continuation. He was no longer certain which version of himself had picked up the call, or how many had listened. When he reached the edge of the town square, he sat on the same bench where he had once spoken to no one. The wood felt unchanged, the stone beneath his feet still cold. But within that familiarity, something had shifted. He no longer searched for the point of return. He understood now that return was not a direction, but a condition. He would not leave Weston in the way he had arrived. He might never leave in any way that could be measured. But what had entered with him, the doubt, the fracture, the weight of unclaimed memory, had found shape. And that shape no longer required a name to endure. There are places that do not speak unless spoken through. Weston is one of them. It does not lure. It does not resist. It simply waits, holding the shape of those who arrive without fully knowing what brought them. Time within its borders does not bend. It reorders. What seems like coincidence soon settles into rhythm. And what begins as memory often ends as transcription. Those who pass through leave traces. Not footprints, but signatures, subtle repetitions, turns of phrase, decisions made before they feel like choices. Some arrive seeking closure, others seek truth. But Western does not offer either. It offers structure, frame, the bones of something that will hold what cannot be carried. Rowan Hatcher came to Western to document a history. He found instead a record of himself written long before he had the language to recognize it. The journal he left behind now rests in the back room of the municipal archive, shelved without label, surrounded by files no longer checked out. Visitors do not request it. Librarians do not catalogue it. But once opened, the entries resume where they left off, in a hand that cannot be traced, with ink that does not dry. People still see him sometimes. Not clearly. Not by name. A man walking down Alder Street before sunrise. A silhouette seated in the bakery window after closing. A customer at the pharmacy who speaks softly and pays in cash. No one remembers when he arrived. No one recalls watching him leave. His name no longer appears on local records. His reflection no longer follows just one set of footsteps. The town does not claim him. It remembers him, and that is enough.